Today's lesson is entitled New Imperialism, and hopefully a term in that title looks very familiar to you. And it is imperialism. It's not the first time that we've talked about this term directly and indirectly in our lessons, but in the 1800s and the 1900s, that time period, sometimes at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, is called the age of new imperialism. Let's talk about a definition here from the start. Imperialism is when powerful nations dominate other nations. It's when nations go into other places around the world and basically take them outright. There are many examples from our past classes in world history that we saw powerful places taking over other places. Any of the empires that we've talked about in world history class is an example of imperialism. Rome, when they created their empire, and at the time of empire, they literally were called Imperial Rome. Alexander the Great was an imperialist. The Mongols were imperialists. They dominated other places. In the 1800s and the 1900s, imperialism is going to take a different route. And it's when bigger, more powerful countries all over the world, the majority of European countries, even the United States, is going to get into the mix of going around the world and taking over countries. Now, on the slide are political cartoons. And if you look at the top left slide, you can see that there's a pizza, and it's entitled China. And you can see the English, you can see the Germans, you can see models of people that represent countries that wanted to carve up China. If you look down to the bottom right, there's an octopus there that represents England. And you can see the octopus's tentacles are grabbing Egypt and grabbing India and grabbing Canada and grabbing all these different places around the world. In the top right-hand corner, you can see the continent of Africa, and you can see a man standing all over it, which represents a European man, and possibly Arthur Rhodes, who's going to claim Rhodesia, and we'll see how Africa was absolutely annihilated by imperialism to start this lesson. Now, what are the causes? Why did places in the late 1800s and early 1900s feel like they needed to go around the world and take over inferior nations? Well, there was a need around the world to be self-sufficient. Countries, especially countries in Europe, didn't want to depend on each other for resources. Britain didn't want to depend on France for resources. France didn't want to depend on the Germans for resources. So they went to places around the world, they claimed them outright, and they took their resources with them. Okay? That made them self-sufficient. And they didn't have to rely upon any countries in Europe, for example, for help. There's a need for new markets, and this is an effect of the Industrial Revolution. Now, by this time in the world, the Industrial Revolution had hit all of the European countries and the United States, for example. There was a need for new markets because factories all over the world were producing a lot of product. For example, in England, those factories were producing so much product that they could not sell all the product to English people. So they went to places around the world and brought their products with them, which opened up a new market, a place where goods are bought and sold. Nationalism is a cause of imperialism, which is a major lesson that we'll talk about within this lesson on imperialism. Now, nationalism was a term that we learned after the defeat of Napoleon. And it was when there's an intense pride or feeling of pride in one's country. So patriotism is another word for nationalism. Well, the Germans saw that the French were going around the world and taking territories outright. So the Germans said, well, we're going to do it too. And the English saw the same thing. And the Italians saw what was going on. So to keep up with other countries, this pride that they had in their own country, they decided to do the same thing. Outlets for population. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there's an increase in the population in the world, especially in Europe. So if you're an English factory worker and your government came to you and said that we just took over a place down in the Caribbean called the Bahamas, and we'd like to send you there to go and work in one of our factories that we have there, that was appealing to people that had always worked in a factory in Britain. So it was a way that they could take the population away from their country and move people to the colonies, to their imperial claims, and allow for them to decrease the population. Now, just as the early explorers from Spain and Portugal went and took over territory, they justified it by spreading religion. Remember that? Except they went ahead and took all of their resources and gold anyway. Well, guess what these new imperialists are going to claim? They're going to claim that they want to spread religion. They want to spread culture. And there's a book called White Man's Burden that's going to be written that's going to explain how white Europeans wanted to spread a white culture to people around the world, which meant education, which meant reading, which meant language, which meant writing, and all these other things. Just like the Spanish and the Portuguese explorers, it was a horrible, horrible justification because in the end, they took all their resources back with them to their native country. This diagram shows you a real good diagram of causes, economic causes, political and military causes. You can see that there were military bases that were built on these colonies and these imperial claims all over the world. There's technological causes that come into play, social reasons why. You can see the spreading of Christianity. You can see that they wanted to share Western civilization ideas. And all these justifications are causes of why countries around the world in the late 1800s and 1900s go ahead and start to claim territories around the world. Now, the effects of this are very simple. You know, one effect is if you're looking at the map of Africa, every single color in Africa is a representation of a European country that went into Africa and took that African country outright. And you can see that the green represents France and the pink represents Britain. And you can see that there are borders there. Well, guess what? Along those borders, there were little battles that were fought, okay? So there are bitter rivalries that are formed among these colonial powers. These imperialists, the European countries that went into Africa, for example, and took these territories outright, just basically took them. So there's going to be rivalries that form along these borders, for example. Another major effect of this new age of imperialism is that colonized people didn't want to be colonized. Native people did not want to learn English. Native people did not want to learn German. Native people did not want these imperialists claiming their territory. So there is going to be a growing hatred all over the world. And this was not just in Africa. This happened all over the world, as we're going to see in my lesson today, that these colonized people hated the imperialists, hated the bigger countries that came in and dominated their country. So let's go to Africa. So here's some specific imperial claims. So of all the places that are going to be effects of imperialism, Africa was claimed the most. It was claimed the most. Now, you can see that on this map, you can see exactly how it was claimed. You can see the British, you can see the French, the Belgians, the Portuguese, the Italian, the Spanish, the Germans later on, right before World War I, are going to go into Africa and basically just take those territories outright. Now, this is imperialism in Africa in 1850. You can see the British were already in South Africa. You can see that there's some red British claims along the Ivory Coast in the western part of Africa. You can see a little bit of the French. You can see a little bit of the Portuguese, which stems from the Portuguese age of exploration, where they stopped over in the southeast part of Africa to supply their ships before going across the Indian Ocean over to India in search of spices, if you recall that. And you can see the Spanish are there a little bit. Now, in that same year, 1850, the Belgians are going to take the Congo, the Germans are going to take some areas, and the Italians are going to take some areas. Now, that's 1850. Now, by 1914, which is the year that World War I starts, you can see that basically all of Africa was taken. Now, there are only two places in Africa that were not taken, and they are represented by a white color on the map that you're looking at. Now, to the east, the larger white area is Ethiopia, and there is a great story about why Ethiopia remained independent all the way up until 1914. It's because the Ethiopians fought off the Italians. Okay, so the Italians, it's a really interesting part of world history, are going to roll into Ethiopia. And the Ethiopians, however, had the high ground, the Ethiopian highlands. It was a mountainous region, and they had weapons. And they literally fought off the Italians when the Italians moved into Ethiopia. Now, fast forward to World War II, the leader of Italy during World War II is a guy named Benito Mussolini, is going to remember this event in history, and we will revisit this event. But for the time being, it was very embarrassing for the Italians that the Ethiopians literally fought them off and did not allow for the Italians to take Ethiopia. Now, over on the west coast of Africa, you can see a real small little area that's represented by the white area that remained independent. That is the country of Liberia, and it's a great story. When slavery ended in the United States, there were freed ex-slaves that were allowed to return back to Africa. So they went across the Atlantic Ocean and they landed on the west coast of Africa and eventually created their own country. And they named it Liberia. Liberia to this day is named after the term liberty. Liberty, because it was created by a bunch of ex-slaves that were free once the Americans abolished slavery in the Americas. They came back to Africa and they started their own country. And most people that live in Liberia today are descendants from ex-slaves that worked in the United States. Now, Africa wasn't the only place that was claimed. So here's a map, and it shows you a real good idea of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. You can see that India and Burma was absolutely dominated by England, okay? In fact, India by 1910 was called British India. You can see the French in light purple are going to take territory in the southeastern part of Asia, which back then was literally called French Indochina. Today, we call it Vietnam. You can see that the Netherlands are going to take areas there in Indonesia. To this day, they are called the Dutch East Indies. And then there are some hypocrites, and I call them hypocrites for a reason, that are going to take territory over in Southeast Asia. Now, the dark purple color is represented by the United States, and they are going to become an imperial power in the 1900s, well, in the late 1800s, but definitely by 1910, and they're going to take a place called the Philippines. Now, I call them hypocrites because not too long ago, a couple hundred years ago, we were fighting for our freedom. All right, we were fighting for our freedom. Not even barely 150 years ago, we were fighting, and now to fight off an imperialist, the British that claimed the colonies, we fought them off, and now we have become an imperial power by 1910. Now, right off the coast of Florida is a great example of this new imperialism that hit the world in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Just off of our coast of Florida is a great example. You can see in the territories, there are United States possessions. So the United States did claim territories off our coast, like Puerto Rico, which is under our protection to this day. You can see some areas are under the United States or have influence of the United States. But then you can also look at the British. The British came over here to the Caribbean and took the Bahamas. To this day, you can see the Bahama Islands is protected by Britain. You can see Jamaica, which is located just south of Cuba. It's protected. It's a British possession and a protectorate to this day. And you can definitely see some territories in South America that are protected by the British as well. You can see the little islands over there in the Eastern Caribbean, like Guadeloupe has the French as a protectorate, Antigua, Dominica, Martinique. You can see the United States Virgin Islands, okay? So just off of our coast, you can see all kinds of examples of imperialism that is still possessions to this day.